Now that we've talked about the insects, now we'll get into more of the kind of management issues, some things to look out for. I'll kind of move through these parts a little bit more quickly, and then we'll get to a couple of insects and then some beneficials. The main thing with pests, with some of the insect pests, is that their injury, it tends to be more aggregated. So when it starts, you get patchiness to where they're feeding. So it might start off in the edge of a field or an edge of an area and then kind of make its way in. You might see one plant getting taken out while the other ones are still alive, and then it starts to kind of move along. So here we see, so what I mean by patchy versus very even across the landscape. So in this case, we had snowpack. So this was an environmental factor. So snowpack, and then everything above that froze. Okay, so when you look at that across the landscape, and maybe you think, well, is this some pest or something that's causing this? You look to see that's very even. Usually when it's even like this, or if there's some pattern associated with it, it tends to be more of an abiotic factor, an environmental factor, improper irrigation, or something associated with that, versus insects specifically. In this case, we have a field that might be about 160 acres or something on center pivot irrigation, so it's just watering. But you can see that the plants are unevenly watered, but there is kind of a pattern to what's going on here. So maybe if we were on the ground level, we might see that, well, this 50-foot spot here is filled with a particular insect. When I go across that, there's another area that doesn't have insects, and then I move to another place, the next 50 feet have insects, and there's some weird pattern to that. It might actually be due to irrigation or some other patterns that are going on, because remember, as I talked about, some of the abiotic factors then lead to some of the insect issues later. So that would be an example there. Look at the new growth. You'll see a lot of insects that are attacking the new stuff, so new branches that are coming out, new buds, new leaves that are being expanded. And why is that? Well, insects actually, they need nitrogen. They need amino acids in order to have the building blocks, in order to reproduce, in order to build tissues in their own body. And that new growth does help to provide that. And so whenever you look at that new growth, you'll see a flush of insects usually on that new growth. When we over-fertilize, that's where you'll see that too, because there's a buildup of nitrogen in that, and so the insects are really keen on that particular plant because of that high nitrogen concentration. What kind of insect caused this damage here? Aphids, piercing sucking insect of some sort. Yep, that's that traditional look to that type of insect damage. The other thing is check for a root problem. So we're used to looking above ground, things that we can see, but sometimes things are happening below ground that are making things occur above ground, right? So look for some of those stages in the soil. Look at the stems at the base of that plant. That might be causing some of this lodging here in this corn. In turf grass, it could be larvae that are in the soil. I talked about insect life stages, that the immature life stages tend to be the most susceptible to different types of treatment. I mean, it's easier to smash one of those larvae of an insect versus the adult. You know, especially with squash bugs, that's a good example where the small ones, those squish pretty easily, but once they get really big, you need a shoe or something to really squish them. So make sure we're dealing with the most susceptible stages, the eggs and the young nymphs and larvae, and then time any of those treatments so that you're getting those particular stages. As I talked about earlier, if you have adults, you may have missed your window of opportunity to actually manage them as best you could. We want to reduce plant stress. So again, going back to clean seed, having clean plant stock, make sure that if you're going to bring new plants in, and you have a traditional pest problem, that you're getting varieties that are resistant to a pest if it's available. Diverse plantings can also help. When we have diverse plantings, that encourages beneficial insects as well, the predators. They're flowering at different times, and it allows an alternative food source for those predators. So when pests come, the predators are there. Sometimes when you plant only one type of plant, it flowers all at one time, and then it goes away. The predators need alternative sources. So if it flowers once and then it goes away and predators don't have anything to feed on, they're kind of moving around to different areas. So you're not encouraging them to be in the area. So diversity is key. Planting location and irrigation design, it goes back to making sure we don't have drought-stressed plants and making sure that things that are fertilized properly. So if you buy two types of plants that have different requirements, but you plant them in the same garden and you're watering them the same, one of them is bound to be stressed in some way. And so that might actually have a plant that then sticks out like a sore thumb, and then insects will then be attracted to that particular group of plants. Proper fertilization as well. So briefly, for chronic pests, so things that we're always seeing, preventative management's key. We'll talk a little bit about squash bugs later, but that would be one where we have this. So sanitation could be just cleaning up garden debris. That would be one way. If you have refuge sites where you have weedy areas on the edges of your property, that might be a nice place for an insect to hide out for the winter, and then they just move back into your garden. So cleaning up those areas would be key. Traps, exclusion barriers, using dormant oils and sprays, that can help out with some of these chronic pests for preventative management. And then spring applications of systemic or insecticides that have a residual. So for aphids, putting on some of those horticultural oils, that's helpful because you're suffocating some of those egg stages now, that way they're not flourishing later. There's also secondary pests, and what I mean by secondary pests is there's several insects where they're actually held in check by natural predators. They might be around, but they're around at low levels, so they won't actually be causing a whole lot of damage. But it's until there's environmental changes, or maybe we apply an insecticide for something else and we've killed off the predators for an insect. We see this with aphids, whiteflies, mites, scales, where let's say lady beetles are feeding on these aphids, they're keeping them at low levels. Maybe we have a caterpillar of some sort and we decide, well, we want to kill this caterpillar, so we apply a broad spectrum insecticide, an insecticide that has broad activity. We kill not only the pests but the beneficials of an aphid. Now the aphid then is able to reproduce without any predators being there, and it takes time before those predators get back to a level that they can suppress those aphids, so then we have to control them. So this is the secondary pest resurgence there. So that's what I mean by secondary pests. So selective controls, if you can, even in this case, water alone or water with an insecticidal soap, that's soft enough on a beneficial community that then the beneficials are still around and the aphids are brought to a level that then the predators can catch up. Okay. For the primary pests, this could be fruit feeders, like codling moth. We know that one's specific to apples. We know that it may occur every year, and we can sort of watch out for this. So target and timing is really critical. And I had mentioned that on our website, we actually have this, it's called a traps component of our website, and it looks at modeling, looks at predictive modeling. So we use weather stations, and because insects are temperature dependent with their development and their activity, we can sort of predict when the flush of these moths will start to come. And so if you look on our website, when that date comes, we provide a recommendation that, hey, you're in an area that we're recommending that you consider some type of treatment because these moths are making their way in. So this would be one of the ways that you can use it for this type of primary pest. Having some insecticides that are there for that period when those insects are there, and then conserving the beneficials, the natural enemies that actually feed on those insects. I wanted to just briefly mention a couple of these turf insects. I work with turf quite a bit, but this goes back to the associations. Okay, so a couple of insects that are damaging to turf include billbugs. So these are a type of weevil. They have a snout nose. They are a beetle, so bug here isn't necessarily a correct term, but it is its common name. But Here they have the hardened forewings, so that would mean it's a beetle. But this is the larval stage. So this is what we find below ground, and that's the damaging stage in turf. They don't have legs, so that's the key characteristic, and they have a distinct brown head. So matching these two together, so they're feeding on different things slightly because they're feeding above ground and these guys feed below ground, but they're the same species. White grubs, you might have seen these C-shaped grubs before. They have legs. That's different from the billbugs. But the main thing here is look at the adults. So Japanese beetle, which actually, we found it in Orem, but right now it's actually not very existent. We find a couple here and there, but they're not a problem at this point. But May and June beetles, how many of you have seen these come to lights at night? Very common, especially around sporting areas, maybe a baseball field at night when they have those bright lights and you see these beetles flying around. They're attracted to light. But this is the adult stage. So when you start to see their activity, you know that in a couple of weeks you'll have eggs being deposited in some area and that these grubs will then be there later. Sod webworms, this one's actually the subterranean sod webworm is more problematic than some of our other sod webworms, but the moth itself, if you've ever walked through your turf and you start to see fluttering moths right at the low level, that would be this particular insect. The larvae will feed in the crowns and more down below ground a little bit. And the idea here, again, is looking at these relationships. So here's the larval stage, the damaging stage. Remember that moths have that coiled mouth part, so they're feeding on different things. But the idea is making this relationship here. Okay. So I'm going to skip a little bit of this. Let's see, I'll just talk briefly about the life cycle in terms of insects generally. So with billbugs, generally, right now, or at least during the winter, they're in the adult stage, just hiding out, waiting for spring to come. When it warms up, then they lay their eggs. Larvae then emerge from those eggs. They pupate, and then they become adults, and they get ready for the winter. So this is sort of the general life cycle of a billbug. Now, insects are temperature dependent. So when it's warm, when it's a warm winter, when it's a warm spring, their activity happens earlier. Their development occurs more quickly. They can go through each of their life stages more quickly. And so if you take this on a warm year, you would actually shift it just slightly earlier. So adults might actually be more active in March. Eggs are really coming out late March into April. May is when we're starting to see more larvae, that kind of thing. So when it's warm, you can move or shift these or expect that insects are going to be active earlier. Now when it's cool, the opposite's true. So it's just like us, at least for me, when I get up and it's really cool, it's hard for me to really get going. I have to get my blood flowing, but it's hard to do that when it's cold. So insects, their metabolism is slowed down, their development is slowed down. So in cool, wet springs, things are going to be slower. And I think, let's see, I have this data for billbugs in 2011 in Cache Valley. We had a really cool wet spring that year. We had very low billbug activity really that whole summer compared to 2012, which actually was a warmer year, and even last year was a very warm year as well, spring and summer. And we got a lot of activity early on. And so temperature really has an impact on insects generally. And this is for all insects. Let's see, just generally, in terms of billbugs, what is this here? Frass, exactly. So even if you didn't find the billbug specifically, if you started to pull the turf up, you might actually find this sawdust-looking frass. The larvae, as I mentioned, they're legless. So, and this is kind of just to give you an idea of how big they are, about half the size of a penny. This is as big as the larvae you're going to get for billbugs. Okay. Now, I'm going to transition here to insecticides, but even though I'm talking about this in terms of turf, the insecticide classes that I'll talk about are actually available for a lot of different settings. So I want you to be aware of that. So don't think that I'm just going to talk about turf altogether here. But one of the things that I did was I just looked up on the Utah Department of Ag and Food's website, well, what's registered for turf grass for managing white grubs, billbugs, and sod webworms? And this list here isn't a list that tells me which one's the best ones to use, but rather there's 100+ products out there that have imidacloprid, an active ingredient called imidacloprid. There's 100+ products that have this active ingredient called bifenthrin. And so you can see this for each of this top 5 that I found here. So carbaryl, there's 20+ products out there with carbaryl, which maybe known it as 7, but same active ingredient there. So let's talk about these groups specifically. So mode of action, how do these groups of insecticides kill an insect? Well, how many of you have heard of pyrethrum? A couple of you. So organic version, it's chrysanthemum flowers. You know, they crushed seeds and flowers together and actually found that they have insecticidal properties. They synthesize this into what we know as the pyrethroids and pyrethrins. So bifenthrin, cyfluthrin, these are all active ingredient names. Permethrin, have any of you heard of these before? If you look at the bottle on the label, instead of just looking at the actual product name, look at the active ingredient. And so here, ending in thrins, you end up being in the same class of insecticides. Okay, so they're all going to work pretty similar in this way. So one is that they're active through ingestion and contact, so the insect has to eat it, or the product has to land on the insect's cuticle in some way, shape, or form in order for it to be active. There's no systemic activity, so it's not going to get moved or absorbed into that plant. Okay? They're called sodium channel modulators, and what does this mean? Well, this is targeting a component of the insect's nervous system. So even pyrethrum, it's working in the same way. So sodium flows into a cell, and that causes a nerve impulse through a gate. And so that nerve fires, gets ready to fire. Now, the gate closes, and then sodium gets pumped out of that cell, and then the nerve actually relaxes. And so what these insecticides do is they actually keep this little gate open. So sodium flows in, get a nerve impulse. The gate never closes, so sodium keeps flowing in, the nerve keeps on firing, the insect becomes paralyzed, and then eventually it dies. So that's the way this group of insecticides works. So whether you have bifenthrin, permethrin, they all kind of work in this way. They're targeting a specific part of the nervous system. I just put this up because in terms of grub control, we haven't had good success for these with grub control because why? So bill bugs are actually in the stems of turf grass to start off with, and then they kind of eat their way down into the about where the root zone is, and then they feed on the roots. So these are, remember, active through contact and also through ingestion. It's really hard to get these products down into the soil and where these bill bugs are at, but yet you will find these products in association for grub control in turf. Partly because I think they're mostly meant to actually control the adult stages that are around there. They're not going to control the larval stages. So I find them to be least reliable in the soil as a soil application. But for other settings, pyrethroids are commonly used for on the canopy of plants. Pyrethrum, you would use it up on top of a canopy of a plant. And that's because it's going to come into direct contact with the insect, or at a level where, as the insect's feeding, it's going to ingest some of that product. Okay. Here's another insecticide, chlorantraniliprole, also under the name acelloprin is actually the name of this product. It's used as a preventative control. It's a newer active ingredient, not very water soluble, so it takes a little bit of time to actually move it around because it's not very soluble with that water. Ingestion is required and has very little contact activity. So if we took this product and just sprayed it directly on the insect, well, the insect might die, but mostly because of drowning, not because of the insecticide's activity. It has to ingest it in order for it to work. So how does it do that? Well, the product is systemic, so it's going to be in the plant. And so when the insect feeds on the plant, it's also ingesting the product itself. So that's how it's active. Very low toxicity to vertebrates, so that's a good thing. So how do these insecticides work? Well, they actually bind to muscle cells, or receptors in muscle cells, and it causes an uncontrolled release of calcium. And so what happens after that? Well, the muscle then becomes paralyzed and then the insect dies. So imagine it being a massive Charlie horse to an insect. Okay? And mostly when we look at insects, it's the mouth parts. So those are big muscles in the mouth parts. And so as it's feeding, that insecticide then is messing with those muscles and really getting them paralyzed, and so then they're not able to feed. How many of you have heard of neonicotinoids? A couple of you. They actually have been in the news here and there. Partly they were connected, or people were trying to connect them with colony collapse disorder with bees. What I want to say about this is that that's not a definitive link there. You know, it's just one insecticide. There's a lot of insecticides that actually kill bees. Bees are pretty sensitive to a lot of the different insecticides that are out there, including the neonicotinoids. They kind of got a little bit of a bad rap here. But one of the things with neonicotinoids, they're one of our most widely used insecticides too, next to the pyrethroids that I talked about earlier. So this one you'll find in a lot of different products. So again, these are the different active ingredients. There's a whole lot of products out there, but look for the active ingredient names that I've given you. These are active through ingestion and acute contact. There is systemic activity by these products, so you can use them preventatively. You know, you can apply them early, get them absorbed into the plant, and so when the insects are there and they feed, then they're ingesting the product. They can also be used as a curative control as well. So when they contact the insect, there can be some activity there as well. So how do these work? Well, they actually bind to a receptor in the nerve. So we have a nerve impulse going here. The way nerves talk to each other is by this acetylcholine. It's a chemical that crosses a membrane, attaches to the receptor, so that nerve impulse continues on. There's a couple of enzymes that actually clear this out, so that way the nerve relaxes. What these insecticides do is they directly bind here at this receptor, causing the nerve to fire. So then the nerve becomes paralyzed, and then they die. And so that's the way, you can see that they're targeting a different part of the nervous system. So in terms of turf, a lot of different preventative management products here, but even for other settings as well, whether it's for trees, other plants, some of the preventative products are available too. And they're going to work in a very similar way. The curative products, the one thing I wanted to mention here, particularly for soil type applications, we have really high pH soils. There's some products that actually break down or degrade very quickly as soil pHs go above about 7.8. So as we increase pH, those products actually degrade fairly quickly. This trichlorophon, I don't know that this product is actually sold in the area. I haven't really seen it all that much here. But I know it can degrade within, I mean, a couple hours really, as you start to get really high pHs. So you apply this thing and it's not going to last very long for soil applications. So again, timing, really important. So when are those larvae there? That's when we want to apply some of these products. So we dug into turf. We pulled out this thing. It was actually a billbug larva. But what's kind of interesting about this? What do you notice that's different about this billbug than I've been showing you? It's red in color. So actually, when we looked at this billbug, red in color, turns out that it had these beneficial nematodes. So there's bad nematodes and there's also good nematodes. So these are entomopathogenic nematodes, microscopic roundworms. So those are those little white lines there. The way that they work is these nematodes enter the insect, and they specifically attack insects. So this group anyways. It enters through the mouth parts or through the breathing apparatus called spiracles in insects. you might have a couple of them enter a host. They then regurgitate a bacteria that kills the host, kills the larva, and allows the nematodes to develop and reproduce. So then after that, you might get about 1,000 or so that actually exit the host and go and search for a new larva to go and feed on. And so here's a healthy grub versus one that was infected by a nematode. Now, what I wanted to point out here is a lot of these different beneficials are already resident in our yards, in our gardens, maybe at not the levels that we want them to be, but they're around. And so for this person, I just told them that if they started to see some of these brown spots, that actually might recover if you have these beneficial nematodes already in your soil. So I may not actually apply anything in this case. But there's also beneficial nematodes, beneficial fungi, all these diseases that are available that you can apply just as you would an insecticide. You can put them into a small spray tank and start to spray them around. But the idea is start to think about there are diseases that attack insects, and there are some that are resident, and there's some that you can purchase.